I'm very happy to be here. My topic of discussion that I will be analyzing today is the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion was an event that took place shortly after the conception of the United States Constitution and provided the first true test of the new system of government that our founding fathers created. Through this test, the resolve of that era's political parties, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, were hardened. It also set the precedents for future arguments over how much power the federal government should have and where the line of government overreach lies. As a brief history of the Whiskey Rebellion, in the years after the Revolutionary War, often called the Critical Period, the United States was in a state of disarray. From bottom to top, our very young country had no sense of self-identity. Through the Articles of Confederation were loosely binding, and some would argue that statement is generous, the United States lacked common ground and leadership. This later came in the form of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, more than 10 years since the birth of our country. Although the Constitution wouldn't go into effect until March of 1789 when the Confederation Congress signed it. With its newfound power, the freshly formed federal government found itself still in excessive amounts of debt from the Revolutionary War. Wars are expensive. In an effort to remedy that, in 1791, the government passed legislation instituting an extremely expensive tax on whiskey. The tax ranged from 7 to 18 cents per gallon of whiskey. The weight of the tax directly correlated with the amount produced. Therefore, the larger distilleries were affected a great deal less than smaller distilleries. The price of whiskey per gallon was around 70 cents. On the high end of the tax, 18 cents per gallon. This equates to about 25%, which, if you're a small distillery, could quite possibly put your profit margins in the red. Today, a 25% tax may not seem particularly outrageous, but in the context of this era, where the country hadn't experienced taxes like this since King George's Intolerable Acts, it was very concerning. As soon as the legislation was passed, it was met with rebellion. Initially, the rebellion was in western Pennsylvania, led mostly by farmers and small-time distillers. In July of 1791, a meeting took place at Redstone Fort in which rebels organized against the tax. The acts of rebellion were often violent in the form of stoning and tarring and feathering the tax collectors who came to do their duty. If you're unfamiliar, tarring and feathering is pouring boiling tar on somebody and then throwing feathers at them. It's a very gruesome way to die. The federal government saw this as a major issue. Not only was it a deliberate middle finger to the government that they weren't paying their taxes, but it brought back the memory of Shays' Rebellion in 1786. The government's ability to stop Shays' Rebellion, or lack thereof, signaled to the people and government of the United States that the Articles of Confederation weren't working. It did not instill any confidence in the effectiveness of the institution in place, which was a major factor in the creation of the Constitution. The government knew that their reaction to the situation could not produce the same result as Shays' Rebellion, and was going to set the tone of how the country would be governed. Therefore, in 1792, President George Washington issued a proclamation admonishing the rebels. Essentially, he told them to cease their rebellious actions and get on with their lives and pay their taxes. This was Washington's attempt to resolve the issue in a peaceful manner. He had no desire to exercise executive power, although it could be said that Washington saw the writing on the wall and knew that his proclamation would fall on deaf ears. Therefore, in 1792, the Militia Act was passed, which allowed the president to gather and use state militiamen for government actions. As Washington probably suspected, his proclamation was met with complete disregard and continuous rebellion. The rebellion spread to the surrounding counties, and eventually tax collectors' houses were being burned down. Finally, at its peak, around 7,000 rebels gathered outside the city of Pittsburgh with the intent of attacking. This was a preemptive strike anticipating an attempt from Washington to quell their rebellion with force. The force was prevented from attacking the city with a peace offering of several barrels of whiskey. Alcohol, always a good idea. At this point, Washington was forced to play the hand he was dealt, and in 1794 gathered over 12,000 militiamen from surrounding states. Said militia was then marched into western Pennsylvania, where the rebellion was already disbanded. Most of the main leaders of the rebellion were on the run. However, some suspects were rounded up and stood trial in Philadelphia. Only 2 were found guilty, but were later pardoned by President Washington. Therefore, nobody truly got in trouble for this. The events of the Whiskey Rebellion saw the philosophy of James Madison being tested. James Madison believed that when law fails, force is necessary to restore order. The Whiskey Rebellion was a prime example of the government exercising the power of force upon its citizens to ensure the well-being of the majority. Washington claimed that government exists by the affection of the people, but many people saw this as an act of federal authority against the wishes of the people. In hindsight, it was in the best interest of the country and restored order. However, it sets a dangerous and concerning precedence of the government being able to enforce its legislation upon citizens by force. What happens when the legislation is not in the best interest of the country? This is exactly the position that Thomas Jefferson took. According to him, the people should have more power than the government. He proved this through his presidency by repealing most of the tax legislation. Alexander Hamilton, on the other hand, the leader of the Federalist Party, felt as though the taxes were necessary to eliminate the national debt, and that a more powerful federal government was also necessary. Some even believed that Hamilton provoked the rebellion to build more power for the federal government. Either way, the success of the administration in dealing with the Whiskey Rebellion only hardened his resolve, and whereas the Anti-Federalists were concerned of the precedents that it sets. With the benefit of hindsight, the Whiskey Rebellion was the first example of the expansion of executive power made by the president and the start of what has been referred to as the Imperial Presidency. The events of the Whiskey Rebellion set the tone for the political parties of the era and gave them a defined issue to disagree on, which is all about what politics is about, disagreeing. So, what school of thought was correct? It greatly depends on your philosophy, and everybody has a different answer. The Whiskey Rebellion is a great example of how a constitutional democratic republican government should restore order when laws are ignored. Force was used as a last resort, and the power of force was dissolved once order was restored. Government will always have to adapt with society, but must also be closely monitored for fear of it becoming power-hungry. We face the same issues today in how we make decisions in our government. Do we allow the government to have more power to fix problems? And if we do, where do we draw the line as a united people? Just like our founding fathers, I don't have the answers. However, we can learn from the results of the Whiskey Rebellion, and we can safely say that sometimes government intervention is necessary to maintain peace and order. A great example of this is the events of January 6th on Capitol Hill. Politics aside, in both cases, a small amount of the population violently rebelled against the decisions made by their democratically elected representatives. Although the Whiskey Rebellion was considerably longer and involved many more people, both situations saw an attempt to have the issue solved peacefully and then the violent rebellion quelled by force. The Whiskey Rebellion and countless other historical events continue to teach us about the nature of man and how we can adapt as a society. Thank you.